As I've gotten older as a gamer, I find myself more and more veering off of the path of the usual publishers and developers in search of different and unique games. And one company that I've kept coming across is Human Entertainment. Despite only being active for 16 years, and only having their names on game boxes for 10, Human are responsible for many intriguing and ambitious games, during the company's lifespan and beyond. Founded in 1983 as TRY Corporation, they merged with Communicate Inc. in April 1987 to form Sonata, the name of which was derived from the names of the board of directors. Sonata was later renamed Human, likely upon entering the publishing business. With their first self-published game, they branded themselves Human Creative, changed it the next year to Human Creative Group, before settling on Human Entertainment in 1992. Human started two companies with two other companies, Beck with Bandai and Hunex with NEC. They make Bandai/Banpresto and visual novel type games respectively. There's little to suggest that Human exerted any control over either of these companies, or that they helped Human financially, but it's still interesting to know. There was also little in the way of crossover, so to speak, but Human did publish Uchu Senkan Yamato for Beck on PC Engine CD, and later a few games for Hunex on PS1. What TRY did from 1983 to 1985, I have no idea, but their first game as far as I know was Gyrodyne for Taito, a simple helicopter shooter. Then they helped Nintendo with Nazo no Murasamejo. Then, as Sonata, they did the whole Family Trainer series for Bandai, including stadium events and Dance Aerobics, which is notable for being the first rhythm music game. They did Top Rider, which is notable because of its inflatable motorbike accessory, and while they did very few platforming games, and none after they started publishing games themselves, they did develop Monster Party for Bandai, which is notable for being wacky, and Kabuki Quantum Fighter for HAL, which is notable for being good, and if they were capable enough to make a game as good as that, why stop? The end credits suggest a sequel, but alas, none came. To move forward, we now need to go back to 1986. At the time, then TRY employee Masato Masuda was enjoying a night of Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling and saw a match between Giant Baba and Abdullah the Butcher that left a big impact on him. And he took that with him to the development of Pro Wrestling on Famicom Disk System, which got ported to the NES the next year. Pro Wrestling was only the fourth wrestling game ever made actually, and it's where A Winner Is You came from. But it's also notable because it's the direct predecessor to Masuda's next wrestling game, Fire Pro Wrestling Combination Tag. Now personally I don't know too much about wrestling games. I had Tecmo World Wrestling as a kid and enjoyed it, but that's about the only one I've played. But even I have heard of the Fire Pro Wrestling series, which is Human's most numerous and profitable series. It uses a timing-based grapple system instead of button mashing, features real wrestlers under fake names, and is always in 2D, except those 2 times when it wasn't. On the 6th release, Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3 Final Bout, a certain Goichi Suda worked as a writer. His good work earned him a directing gig on Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, where his choice of a very sad ending was unorthodox to say the least. I think it was awesome though. Masuda was his superior at the time, and in a 4Gamer interview, Suda talks about looking up to him, and that he told him that he could make the next Fire Pro Wrestling more freely, which spurred on his creativity going forward. In 1990, Human started the Human Creative School, potentially the world's first vocational school for game development. Masato Masuda taught programming there. Many of the students would go on to work for Human, and 4 of the students' graduation projects were made into real games. They were Egypt, a puzzle game for Famicom; Dragon's Earth, a medieval real-time strategy game for Super Famicom; Septetrion, which was localized as SOS, released by Vic Tokai; and the Firemen, which got a release in Europe as the only game Human ever released themselves outside of Japan. I would say Septetrion and the Firemen, both helmed by Human Creative School students, were the catalysts that turned Human from the sports game powerhouse that made the Final Match Tennis, Formation Soccer, and Human Grand Prix series among others, to a company that took risks and championed storytelling. Not that it was encouraged by the leadership, they just wanted the profits, but the employees of Human had big ambitions. Septetrion was the brainchild of then 19-year-old Keita Kimura. It may slightly resemble a 2D platformer, but is more like a survival game, heavily inspired by the Poseidon adventure. You play as any number of characters with their own motivations, and when the boat goes belly up, you have to find your way out while dealing with the constant and random rotations of the ship, preferably while saving other passengers, because if you just save yourself, you get a bad ending. Getting hit on the head or falling from too high up will knock you out. Losing precious time, of which you only have 1 hour of real time. Another inventive idea. Yes, the game is very hard yet short. The layout of the ship is confusing, and the map is nigh on useless. And the game is basically one big escort quest. But the great, gloomy atmosphere, along with the infinite replayability, makes it a kind of classic. The Firemen was Taichi Ishizuka's idea. When it comes down to it, it's a pretty straightforward overhead action game, but instead of shooting aliens or whatever, you're just a firefighting shooting flames with water, while your partner chops them down with his axe, somehow. Here it's less gloom and more action as you fight fires in a high-rise building while rescuing people, and breaking glass for fun. The story is nothing special, but it's not supposed to be. No grand conspiracy or even arsonist is behind it, it's just a day in the life of firemen. But the gameplay is really good, so it's good. Septetrion and the Firemen were billed as PanicSoft, and parts of the Cinematic Live series, both of which make sense, even though I think they maybe could have picked one. I did feel some panic, especially in Septetrion, and the cinematic angle is there in the presentation. Human Entertainment's next most famous employee, Hifumi Kono, had worked there a couple of years at this point, but was stuck working on sports games and was eager for a chance to be truly creative. He proposed a competition within the company for people to submit their best ideas and that the best one would go into production. And it just so happened that Kono's own idea was selected. This idea, and the third in the PanicSoft/Cinematic Live series, was Clock Tower. Clock Tower is one of the earliest survival horror games, and I believe the first one to have you play as someone who is defenseless, running and hiding from an indestructible foe, in this case the Scissor Man. The game has a dark and creepy atmosphere. Shocking scenes, and some great sound work for the time, like the footsteps or the clanging of the scissors. There are many different endings, but no happy ones exactly, and the best ending isn't even canon. The caveat perhaps is that this is a point-and-click game, which might turn some people off, but it shouldn't. Sure, you have less direct control this way, but just like how tank controls in Alone in the Dark or Resident Evil helped convey a sense of unease, so does the point-and-click system. Just remember that you can double-click to run. The inspiration for Clock Tower game-wise came from Alone in the Dark, but in other regards it was inspired by Dario Argento films such as Phenomena, starring Jennifer Connelly. Besides her, Phenomena also has a deformed kid, a crazy mother, and dead teenage girls. The first kill in the movie is done with scissors, but the proper scissors, or hedge clippers I should say, came from the 1981 slasher movie The Burning, which also had a villain with a deformed face. Clock Tower got several ports. The first was for Windows 95, and it added mouse support and some extra scenes and stuff. For instance, now Scissorman does a little dance when he's killed you. The Windows version was ported to the PlayStation, which is the version I have, and I happen to have some kind of special edition of it, with a paper sleeve and a nice booklet. The final port was to the Wonder Swan of all places, which made the game black and white, and had to make some concessions, but otherwise has all the extra little bits that were added to the other versions. By the way, they made the character sprites based on photos of real people, and a woman in the planning department played Jennifer. The clothes she decided herself to wear to the shoot that day was the ones that ended up as her costume in the game. Jennifer might have lost all her friends in the game, but it was lucky for Hifumi Kono that the game was enough of a success for him to be allowed to work on more experimental stuff, and to do the follow-up, Clock Tower 2, or Clock Tower 2nd as it's also known. They didn't attempt to do the first game in 3D, because there weren't anyone at Human at the time who had those skills, and they weren't going to hire expensive freelance experts for a risky game like Clock Tower. But for the sequel, they did. So we got some lovely 1996 quality polygons, bad voice acting.
What wonderful times they were, except for...
And it's still point and click, but still manages to be quite a scary game. It's more gory for one. and the jankiness of the polygons and animations actually make it seem even more otherworldly, and yeah, it's very effective. This time there are two main protagonists, with a returning Jennifer and her caretaker Helen. There are more twists and turns in the story this time, and it's a bit confusing on occasion, but still nice and scary. I have to describe one plot point though that messed with my head, so consider this a spoiler warning. In the original game, Miss Mary had two children, the scissorman Bobby and the giant deformed Dan, right? Bobby falls off of the clock tower at the end, and Dan is incinerated, right? Yet the scissorman is back in the sequel, okay? Ignoring the path where it's a guy dressed up as him, the real scissorman in Clock Tower 2 is Dan, not Bobby. Dan, the huge one. The explanation, supported by the scene they added in the ports, is that Bobby died, but somehow being burned alive changed Dan from a deformed monster to a normal boy. Why didn't they just go with the easy route and had Bobby come back and Dan having died? Now we're left with a very, very implausible scenario. Oh well. There's also the general oddity of the fact that both games take place in Norway of all places. There was one more sequel made during Human's time, Clock Tower 2 The Struggle Within. Actually, it was Clock Tower Ghost Head, an unconnected spin-off produced without Kono's involvement. Maybe that's part of the reason why it's not that well liked by most fans. His next directorial was Mikagura Shoujo Tantedan. It's about three young women in 1920s Japan who solve mysteries for the Mikagura Detective Agency, whose leader, Mr. Mikagura, only steps in at the end of the cases to explain everything, Poirot style. It's basically a visual novel, but the one thing that sets it apart is that while playing you use the mystery-solving trigger system when faced with important information. And doing so gets you points, and a certain amount will make the section that you're in be considered clear and you may proceed. But pick your places. If you run out of triggers, you lose the game. This system may or may not have inspired the Phoenix Wright games and the objections there. I'm not intelligent enough for these kinds of games, so I'll be looking at a guide. There's funny banter between the girls, anime cutscenes, some with QTEs, and plenty of options for all sorts of things. But actually the full game isn't here. The last case only sets up before continuing in the sequel, which came out a year later. It's interesting though that the game comes on 4 discs, but 2 of those only have bonus contents, so seems to me that if they didn't quote-unquote waste 1 or 2 discs, that they could have finished the last case just fine? Kono's final game for Human besides the Mikagura sequel was Neko Zamurai. It's a period piece adventure game about samurai that are cats, though humans exist too. It seems to mostly consist of lots and lots of talking heads and some walking around town. Doesn't look too interesting to be honest, though it does have NPCs with individual schedules and stuff just like Shenmue, so that's kind of cool, I guess. After finishing the Firemen, Taichi Ishizuka said no to working on the sequel and went on a long backpacking journey through the US and Canada, which was a dream of his. The Firemen 2, Pete and Danny, didn't suffer as much from the loss of its visionary as Clock Tower did, but still the sequel is not as good as the original. The level design is a bit simpler, the map is gone, and playing through it, which was pretty easy this time around, I forgot I even could duck and crawl, because the game never demanded it of me. It does have a 2-player mode though, so that's good. Ishizuka would return however, and then he would helm the deeply ambitious project Mizurna Falls.
"6:13 a.m. on the 25th of December. A small town in Colorado, at the foot of the Rocky Mountains called Mizurna Falls."
With a narrator that's clearly not a native English speaker, the game opens with a discovery of Kathy Flannery, who was apparently attacked by a bear, succumbing to her wounds in the hospital, and another girl named Emma is missing. The main cop of the town, Carl Winslow, Al Powell, Mogan Stain, is on the case, but you, playing as Matthew Williams, also tries to find out what happened to Kathy and find Emma before it's too late. Mizurna Falls is clearly inspired by the TV show Twin Peaks, but dials back the psychological and frankly weird aspects of that show. It's also an open-world adventure game, and the most obvious comparison naturally is drawn to Shenmue, which it came out a year ahead of. Although personally I think the term is a bit hard to define. I mean, isn't Legend of Zelda an open-world game? Anyway, Matthew lives in the town of Mizurna Falls, all of which is open to exploration, by foot or by car, and there's also a rowboat to row. The main gameplay consists of going around town talking to people, getting clues and immersing yourself in general, But there are some minigames like a fighting mode and first-person shooting, although it's done via quick-time button presses. The walking controls are of the tank variety, and it's kind of easy to get stuck on parts of the scenery, something that became a problem when I had to run away from a bear. But luckily, all those minigame type sections come with infinite retries. In fact, the only way to actually fail the game is by getting to the end without solving the mystery. See, the whole game runs in almost real time, starting on Christmas Day and ending on New Year's Eve. And the townspeople and various events run on their own schedules, so if you don't get to the right place at the right time, you miss them forever. That makes the game quite difficult, because to get the good ending you need to know what to do and when, i.e. be on a strict schedule yourself. The game also has many bugs, although I haven't run into any myself yet. That coupled with the fact that since saving advances time forward makes you not want to save often, you can see how you need to be both dedicated and patient to beat this one. The walking controls might not be ideal, but using the L and R buttons to turn 45 degrees instantly actually helps quite a bit. The game also uses contextual button prompts only 1 month after Ocarina of Time maybe invented them. I'm not sure. You can call people on your phone with numbers consisting of 4 button presses, and they can call you as well. As an interesting bit of detail, you can't open the menu unless you stop the car first, so Matthew is a responsible driver. Why he has to get out of it to answer the phone though, I don't know. Maybe it's a reception thing. I'm not a good judge of graphics. I'm very forgiving for one. But this game sure is quite blocky and full of texture warping, clipping issues and so on. But something that Human Entertainment always did very well is atmosphere. The constant slow snowfall, the times of day, the camera angles, lighting and dialogue all comes together to make a compelling experience that I want to see more of. Unlike Deadly Premonition, which was inspired by the same show, Mizurna Falls is not what I would call quirky. It's a serious adventure game. One that was never localized, of course. But passionate fans have been working to correct that for a long time now, and just this year a complete patch was released. The main translation was done by a fellow called Resident Evie. Final thing on Mizurna Falls, you can pet the dog. After Septetrion, Keita Kimura did humans only 3DO game, Belzerion, a cyberpunk adventure with first-person 3D dungeons, combat that mixes shooting and fisticuffs, some trippy boss fights, and a lot of loading times. It's not unimpressive for 1994 though. Then he was game designer on Twilight Syndrome, one of humans' most influential games. An adventure game with digitized schoolgirls walking around at night investigating urban legends. The side view seems somewhat inspired by Clock Tower, but I think it's also reminiscent of sound novels when it cuts to full-screen still imagery. There's a lot of ingenuity on display here, and again some great sound work that helps get the game under one's skin. As the story goes, the director of Twilight Syndrome quit midway and Suda51 had to jump in and take over, by which time most of the game was already planned out and he didn't have that much input. I don't have any hard evidence, because I couldn't find it, but I think it was Keita Kimura who was the departed director. First of all, the game had to be split into 2 parts, and Kimura is only credited in the first part. He didn't get director credit on Septetrion either, by the way, even though it basically was. Secondly, his next game wasn't for Human, but for Spike, Yuya Midori Tankintai, a game very similar to Twilight Syndrome, almost as if it's a spiritual sequel. The heart rate simulation is in both games, and the word Twilight even appears. I guess we'll never know, but it seems pretty likely. Suda did get creative freedom on the next game, Moonlight Syndrome. It uses the same kind of gameplay as Twilight Syndrome, but focuses on terrible people instead of ghost stories. It also replaces the mix of pixel art and digitized actors with pre-rendered sprites and lots of CG, which frankly looks worse, especially the CG. On the other hand, the control is much improved. Moonlight Syndrome is arguably the start of Suda's Kill the Past universe, and deserves a place in the Sudaverse, if not in the Human Entertainment Hall of Fame. Neither Keita Kimura nor Suda51 worked on the semi-sequel to Septetrion, Out of the Blue. It's still about a ship in peril, this time the King Windsor, although I think it's supposed to be Windsor. There's no giant wave this time, so there's a mystery to solve in terms of why the ship actually sank, which I think was a decent idea. There are still multiple people to play as and to escort to safety, but here it's all presented in not very impressive 3D polygons. There are tank controls, a lot of narrow corridors, and like last time, people don't always do a good job in following you. The ship tilts around now and then, upon which time you're forced to get down on your hands and knees and just hope it doesn't tilt enough to kill you or the one you're escorting. So make sure to get to a safe spot or grab something before that happens, but it can be easier said than done. The map is more helpful than the original, but it doesn't matter when the game asks you to rescue someone in room 1031, but there are like 40 rooms and no visible room numbers. Septetrion out of the blue wasn't received well by fans, and I can see why. I don't think it's a terrible game, but it's certainly not as good as the original. The director, Hajime Yamazaki, doesn't have any more credits that I'm aware of. Another series that Human got started was Bakuso Dekotora Densetsu, a racing game based on the Japanese subcultural phenomenon of big rigs with intricate modifications and artwork. You duel other truck drivers, get BP, buy new parts, trick out your truck, and race some more. You can switch to regular steering, but the default is a little different as you press left or right to turn your blinkers on, then again to change lanes. You need to swerve around the civilian cars and keep a lookout for your opponent and block him from overtaking you. And it's actually easier to do that with this mechanic. There are also several story scenarios, and the soundtrack is filled with enka songs. This game has got a lot of style. The last human-developed game I'll mention is Remote Control Dandy. A unique game where you control a giant robot. But wait, aren't there many games where you control a giant robot? Well yes, but not like this. Instead of just playing as one, you play as a kid with a remote control controlling the robot. You have to lift one leg at a time and then move yourself around to keep up. The game also comes with a story, and you play as a kid who is the heir to this huge company, and your dad gives you the robot Vodan as a present. Just in time too, as other giant robots are attacking for no apparent reason. It's funny though that another facet of the game, besides just surviving, is money. Despite being filthy rich, you do have a limited amount of funds, and the ungrateful city forces you to pay for any damages you inflict while trying to save it from total destruction. Remote Control Dandy was the first of its kind, and unlike some human games, it has a lot of polish. And being that you play as a little kid, seeing everything from his viewpoint makes you appreciate the size and weight of the robot in a whole nother way. There's also a battle mode with 2-player support, there's pocket station support, and another unique thing, as far as I know anyway, is that the game's soundtrack release came with a disc containing extra missions. Remote Control Dandy was another innovative game, but by now it was 1999, and Human Entertainment's time was running out. Human Entertainment started to go downhill in the late 90s, and according to Hifumi Kono, it wasn't because the games weren't selling well, it was because they were making bad investments like arcade games, education, and a dinosaur theme park? In 1999, Human had about 4 billion yen in debt. By contrast, HAL Laboratory only had 1.5 billion in debt, and they got bailed out by Nintendo. No such luck for Human. I guess Beck and Hunex didn't return any favors. In 2000, the company declared bankruptcy. Ownership of the school was transferred to another company, but it wouldn't last long and closed down in 2003. But the story of Human is far from over. Human Entertainment would at least partly live on through the company Spike, today Spike Chunsoft. In 1999 they didn't have a very rich game development or publishing history, but that started to change when a bunch of ex-Human employees joined them. They also acquired the rights to Twilight Syndrome, Dekotora and Fire Pro Wrestling. As I mentioned earlier, Keita Kimura made Yuya Midori Tankentai at Spike, which unfortunately has never been re-released or translated, and it's very expensive despite being all kinds of intriguing. But there is author and YouTuber Tara A. Devlin who plays and verbally translates all sorts of Japanese horror games and media. Definitely check her out, she's incredible. And I kind of hate her too, because she makes it pointless for me to do anything, but what are you gonna do? Anyway, after Yuyami, Kimura founded a company named after his development team, Team Yura, and made Japanese mobile games. Team Yura folded in 2007, and then he started another company called Hane, and made some more mobile games, until that folded too. He hasn't been heard from since, unfortunately. Hamster now has the rights to Septetrion. Twilight Syndrome was adapted into 3 movies in Japan, and got 2 sequel games. Twilight Syndrome Saikai on PlayStation, which used 3D graphics that actually look good, and Twilight Syndrome Kinjirareta Toshi Densetsu for DS, which uses real photos of actors, along with the polygons when you walk around. Spike did 4 more Decotora games, including one on DS, and many Fire Pro Wrestling games. One that stands out like a sore thumb though is the one they did for Microsoft, where everyone's a 360 avatar. The team behind Remote Control Dandy formed the company Sandlot, who specialized in games where you control giant robots for a while, with Robot Alchemic Drive, Tetsujin 28, and Cho Soju Mecha MG. But they also struck a bit of gold when they made Chikyu Boegun, aka Earth Defense Force, which became a niche series that continues to this day. The main man behind the action at Sandlot, by the way, is Takehiro Honma, who grew up enjoying the anime Tetsujin 28, so he must have been happy when he got to make a game based on it. Konami got the rights to Remote Control Dandy meanwhile, and they did Remote Control Dandy SF, but Sandlot were not involved with that one. Taichi Ishizuka returned to game development one more time at Spike, where he made Hard Luck: Return of the Heroes, which was localized in Europe as Fire Heroes. Another firefighting game that's pretty heavy on story, consisting of 9 chapters, and just the prologue took me over an hour to get through. You can play as 3 different characters, only one of which is an actual firefighter, although everyone will be putting out some fires regardless. Max the cop can shoot his gun, and the architect Scott has access to a complete map. It's a little strange that you can't use the right stick to look around normally, but you can use it to aim the water hoses, etc. Ishizuka seems to also have taken a cue from Septetrion in that there's a 7-hour time limit before the whole building is engulfed in flames, and if you get knocked out, you lose time. The renderware graphics look fine, but the animations look weird. And the basic gameplay is okay, but some of the fires just refuse to die. Hard Luck / Fire Heroes is ambitious in terms of story, certainly lengthwise, but the gameplay I would only call decent really. When it comes to firefighting games on PS2, I prefer Sakurasaka Shobotai by Rakjin and Irem. Today, Ishizuka works as a mountain tour guide in Canada. Hifumi Kono formed the company Nudemaker, where he made some more interesting games like Steel Battalion for Capcom, Infinite Space for Sega, and Senritsu no Stratus for Konami. A hack and slash with a very anime presentation, to the point that each of the 10 chapters have opening, ending, and next episode clips. In the future, mankind is under attack by an artificial intelligence called Meme, which looks like and spawns very organic looking monsters for some reason. And after the Defense Force's main man, Yagami, is killed in battle, a man named Kudan is forcefully recruited to fight for them. When you're not roaming around the main base, the stages take place in side-scrolling hack-and-slash mode, with multiple characters to switch between, flashy special attacks, and information to gather. At the end of a mission, you have to make a report with said information, and if you can't pick the 3 correct pieces of intel, you can't proceed to the hack-and-slash boss fight, in which you control a giant mech. Being that this is a Kono game, the mood is pretty gloomy, and there's a counter permanently on the screen which constantly counts down. It's counting down the population of the whole country. Yikes. A good game with solid gameplay, good world building, graphics, and music. No idea why Konami didn't think this was good enough for English localization. The rights to Mikagura Shoujo Tanteidan were bought by Elf Corporation, who makes hentai games. They re-released the first two for PC and had Nudemaker do a new one, which made their name make sense in a way, but actually the name doesn't mean anything salacious, it's an expression of humility. Sunsoft got the rights to Clock Tower and shared them with Capcom for the third game to get made, again without Kono's involvement. He wanted to return to the well, however, which led to the Kickstarter Project Scissors, which just about resulted in Nightcry, released in 2016 on PC and later on Vita, digital only. Nightcry is, pretty much Clock Tower on a boat. It's still a point-and-click interface, and you go between investigating and running away from a killer wielding scissors, who apparently is magic this time around. You've got your inventory, stamina, need to find hiding places, which may or may not be good ones. And you sometimes struggle with the killer to get away. The changing camera angles don't do you any favors though. And the graphics look about 10 years behind its release date, like an early Xbox 360 game. But I don't mind that, and I could say, well, it doesn't have that classy feel and atmosphere that the original two games have. It's still pretty tense. I think it's pretty good, although most reviews would disagree. Kono and Nudemaker have a hard time getting anything done in today's gaming landscape. They've done some mobile games, but no console games. Kono did write and direct the recent Root film, a visual novel for Kadokawa Games though. Suda 51, who had left Human in 1998 when he noticed that the bonuses were getting smaller and smaller, formed Grasshopper Manufacture and became a rock star of the gaming world. You know him, you love him. But two other former Human employees that you might not know about are Shuji Yoshida, Suda's superior, who left Human in 1995 and founded The Man Breeze, what a name for a company, which was later changed to Aki Corp, and finally Sin Sophia. These companies have made plenty of wrestling games, as well as Def Jam Fight for New York, which was the foundation for the Yakuza PSP games, and they also made the Style Savvy games. Chiyomaru Shikura was a programmer and musician who worked on Dekotora among others, and he's now the boss of Mages, makers of Corpse Party, Steins Gate games, and they recently helped Nintendo out with Famicom Detective Club. So that was Human Entertainment. Going from being a shadow developer to a sports games factory to a brave risk-taking adventure game pioneer who crumbled under the weight of their own ambitions as well as some poor executive decisions. The spirit of Human, if you will, lives on today through its developers, and at least Fire Pro Wrestling is still going strong. I would say my favorite game of theirs is the original Clock Tower. Of course, my fondness for mansions is well documented, but it's the quiet, unsettling, dark atmosphere that does it for me. The relative calm of which is shattered in an exhilarating way when the Scissorman enters the fray. I also have a thing for these family-based storylines, I think. Twilight Syndrome, Mizorna Falls, and Septetrion all nailed their atmospheres too, although I must admit I respect Septetrion more than I actually play it. I just can't see myself attempting to lead 7 idiot NPCs out through that labyrinth of a ship under a time limit for a good ending. It's a shame that Keita Kimura disappeared. He seemed to have a good mind for games with a strong mood. It's also a shame that Human never got a crack at a PlayStation 2. Actually, I have an overall feeling of that's a shame when it comes to Human Entertainment. They made such unique games, and they tried new things, yet they were a little under-equipped and underfunded, and underappreciated. But on the other hand, the games industry has evolved over time, certainly on the indie side where developers will try most anything. And if nothing else, Suda 51 is still out there making out there stuff. Human Entertainment might not have had the longest lifespan, but they still managed to leave their mark.